माझी नेटवर्क.
Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. US President Donald Trump has ruled out an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine after his summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, insisting only a direct peace agreement can end the war. According to media reports, President Trump stated on his Truth Social that ceasefires often do not hold up, making a full peace deal the only viable solution. President Zelensky announces he will meet President Donald Trump in Washington on Monday. He posted on Telegram that he's grateful for the invitation amid fresh diplomatic efforts after the Alaska summit. Ukraine says Moscow launched 85 drones and a ballistic missile overnight, just hours after President Putin and President Trump's talks ended without a ceasefire deal. Kyiv reports shooting down 61 drones as strikes hit 4 frontline regions. A blast at a factory in Russia's Ryazan region has killed 11 people and injured 130 people, with rescuers still searching through the rubble, according to the Emergencies Ministry. Governor Pavel Malkov has said the incident was triggered by a fire inside a workshop about 320 kilometers southeast of Moscow. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has announced she will meet US President Donald Trump in Washington to discuss ending the war in Ukraine, emphasizing the need for European involvement in security guarantees, while European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also welcomed the move, calling it a sign of hope for peace. US President Donald Trump has said Chinese President Xi Jinping assured him that China would not invade Taiwan during his term. According to a Fox News interview, the Chinese embassy reiterated that Taiwan remains the most important issue in Sino-US ties, while Taiwan strongly rejected Beijing's sovereignty claims. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi will visit India from Monday to Wednesday for discussions on the disputed Himalayan frontier. It will only be the second such meeting since the deadly 2020 clash between the two sides. Australia has granted asylum to former Hong Kong lawmaker and pro-democracy activist Ted Hui, along with his family members, more than 4 years after he fled criminal charges linked to the 2019 pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. The Australian Department of Home Affairs has issued approval for Hui, his wife, children, and parents. EU's chief diplomat Kaja Kallas says the United States holds the power to push Russia into serious negotiations. India's foreign ministry welcomed the talks, saying the world wants an early end to the war. Meanwhile, President Zelensky stressed that territorial issues can only be decided by Ukraine. He warned that peace must be real, not just a pause in Russian assaults, and urged stronger security guarantees from both Europe and the United States. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has said that President Trump has embraced Italy's idea of NATO-style security guarantees for Ukraine. Discussions on this, she added, were among the most important outcomes of the summit. And Sweden's foreign minister reaffirmed military and political support for Ukraine while calling for more pressure on Russia to bring lasting peace. For this discussion, we are joined by Peter Corrillo. He's a chief market economist at Spartan Capital Securities. Joins us live from New York. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, what impact could NATO-style security guarantees for Ukraine have on this broader geopolitical landscape?
Well, I think, Zelensky made it quite clear that he's not willing to give up any territory, but at the end, I think he probably will have to. And, I think that it's going to basically be his call at this time. And politically, that could have some ramifications for Western Europe. The whole aim of Western Europe is to try to have a peace deal without Putin keeping any territory. And so it's a very delicate situation, but at the same time, Russia is in desperate need to stop this war. Their economy is basically in shambles. And so I think it's safe to say that that cosmetic meeting that we saw yesterday went well, in the sense that we saw two individuals that seemed to be good friends. And so if that's truly the case, then I think it's a question of convincing Zelensky, and then perhaps an end to the war can come without a ceasefire.
And do you think these guarantees could escalate tensions with Russia further or de-escalate?
I don't really know. I'm not a political analyst, but I would kind of think that if the showcase that we saw between Trump and Putin is for real, then I don't see that happening. I think that Trump is likely to convince Zelensky, but more so convince Putin. So he probably will want to gain some of the access of the occupied territories that they won, but not all of them. And I think that's where probably Trump is probably going to be successful in ending the war.
And given this EU's firm stance that Russia cannot dictate Ukraine's NATO or EU path, how is Ukraine or EU preparing for potential Russian retaliation? What do you think?
Well, that's very true what the EU says, but all we have to do is look at the UN. Since its creation, there have been many a times where the UN has said, stop any war, and I'm not referring just to one, but many wars. And it took months, and nations just ignored it. And so I kind of think that that's the same thing here with NATO. NATO can continue to be vocal, but by the same token, it just really has no staying power. And of course, let's face it, the U.S. is, you might say, the leader in NATO. So if that's the case, then it becomes even more difficult for countries to not have to hear what other countries are saying or doing, or, for that matter of fact, threaten.
And Peter, what do you think, what concrete outcomes would Ukraine hope for when President Zelensky visits President Trump next week on Monday?
I would kind of think that I don't think it's going to happen on Monday. It'll probably go back and forth for a while, but I think it will happen. And I think Zelensky, the best thing he can hope for is that he gets a peace deal without having to give up too much of the territories.
Thank you very much, Peter Cordillo, for always joining us and sharing your insight all the way from US. Now we move on. European analysts have assessed the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska as a mixed outcome, with no agreement reached, but some strategic signals noted. Political analyst Alina Frolova added that the summit fits Putin's strategy to postpone decisions while continuing military actions. Let's listen in. Now we'll move on. European analyst Jacob Funk Kierkegaard of Bruegel said the Trump-Putin summit avoided worse outcomes for Europe, noting that discussions focused on an immediate ceasefire without land swaps. Political scientist Clemens Fischer from the University of Cologne said the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska played out more as a high-stakes drama than a negotiation centered on Ukraine. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Madhav Nalapat. He's an editorial director at TSG. Thank you, Madhav Nalapat, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now that the summit has happened, what's your take? What's your analysis now?
Look, I think we are finally seeing peace, the light of peace at the end of a very, very long and dark tunnel. So I'm quite hopeful that now we'll at least have a timetable, not in years, but in weeks, about when this war will end, once President Putin is done with whatever limited gains he wants. So from that point of view, I would say, as a citizen of the global south, I welcome this, as the Indian government has welcomed this, because we in the global south have suffered terribly. We have been ignored. We have been treated as just collateral damage in this war that is being conducted against Russia by elements of NATO, through Ukraine. From the beginning itself, it has been a hopeless war, and we are very, very happy that finally the end is in sight. And no, President Putin doesn't want to take over the whole of Ukraine. He simply wants those Russian territories back that was ceded to Ukraine when Ukraine and Russia were part of the same Soviet Union.
And Madhav Nalapat, what is your take on President Trump's bold moves about pursuing Nobel Prize, and also, do you think that these peace efforts are genuine or part of his show?
Well, look, he's making a lot of efforts for peace. There's no doubt about it. And if there can be an end to the Ukraine war, well, I think that will bring the Nobel Prize much closer to him. The fact of the matter is, he's finally got President Putin, I think, to agree to some sort of a timetable. And I think he's got an understanding of what Putin has in mind. And from that point of view, I think I'm very optimistic that finally we are going to see the end of this war, possibly in weeks. I've not been optimistic so far, but I'm finally becoming a little optimistic that we are going to see the end of this horrible war that has cost so many Ukrainian lives, cost so many Russian lives, and caused so much of damage as collateral to the economies of the world and the suffering people of the world, especially in the global south.
And now going back to our previous news, so what impact could NATO-style security guarantees for Ukraine have on the broader geopolitical landscape now?
Look, that's a no-go for Russia. There's no question about that. Unless NATO wants to enter into a direct conflict with Russia, I'm not sure anybody in NATO would want that. I mean, giving a kind of a NATO style security guarantees means that, that the Ukrainians can interpret any move by Russia as an attack and call for the rest of NATO to come to assistance. It will immediately become a NATO-Russian war. That will be disastrous for Europe and for the whole world. So I doubt very much that is ever going to happen.
So do you think these guarantees by EU leaders, do you think this is escalating tensions with Russia further or de-escalating?
Look, the EU has been in favor of escalating the war, and now it's the EU taxpayers' money that's funding the war, and Americans are sitting pretty. They're selling weapons at the cost of the EU taxpayers, and I don't think it'll be long before EU taxpayers say, what are you spending our money for? The fact is that Ukraine is losing territory every week, and hardly any gains have been secured by it. Whatever little gain has been secured has already been taken back by the Russians. So how long is the Ukrainian war going to drain the purse of the of taxpayers in the EU. How long will those who want the war uh, be allowed by their taxpayers to continue this kind of a fruitless war?
Thank you very much, Madhav Nalapat, for joining us and sharing your insight throughout our news. Now we move on. In the 48 hours following the President Trump-President Putin summit in Alaska yesterday, military activity intensified on both sides of the conflict. Russian forces claimed to have seized 7 settlements in Donetsk, while Ukrainian forces carried out strikes, including on the Syzran oil refinery in Russia's Samara region. Meanwhile, Russian airstrikes hit the Ukrainian city of Donetsk, causing casualties, and a fire broke out in Sumy after a strike. Russian air defenses reported shooting down a Ukrainian Su-27 fighter jet, while Ukraine claimed precision strikes against key Russian military targets. These actions highlight ongoing escalation despite the high-profile talks between President Trump and President Putin, which produced no breakthrough on the Ukraine conflict. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Major Dr. Muhammad Ali Shah. He's a defense and strategic expert, joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you, Major, for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. So what does this spike in military activity from both sides suggest after Trump-Putin summit?
See, I think in this summit also President Zelensky should have been invited and he should have been called. But anyhow, that's my personal take on it. And but President Donald Trump had certain agendas in mind, and he gave clear instructions. He wanted the land swap deal to take place as well, which meant that Russia will take control of certain parts of Ukraine, and then Ukraine. Now, firstly, I think my personal take is President Trump, who is he to negotiate without the intermediation of a third country? He's no one, I think. Just because America is a superpower. Well, but all said and done, what we want is peace. If he is actually able to get peace, I think that's going to be a very, very good thing. Now, for peace, anything, I mean, whatever stake has to be paid, fine, it's fine. Now, he also mentioned that the aim is to bring Putin to the table for talks, not to negotiate for an immediate Ukraine peace deal. He also downplayed the idea of offering Kyiv security guarantees and revealed that he had spoken to Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. Now, who's a staunch Putin ally? We all know that. Now, the very fact is when Donald Trump comes in and interferes between two wars, be it between a fight with Pakistan during Operation Sindoor. He was the one who announced that.
Major Muhammad, we seem to have lost you here. Muhammad, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, now it's good. So, how significant are Ukraine strikes on Russian targets like the Syzran oil refinery in terms of shifting the conflict's dynamics now?
Right. So, as Martin Luther King once had said, if you want peace, be prepared for war. And similarly, here, Leo Tolstoy, the Russian author, also said, everything is fair in love and war. And being peaceful is better than being right. These were quoted by great people in history earlier. So the very fact is now, in a peace deal like this, when there is talk of ceasefire, when there's talk of peace, I think it's a very, very good sign. But again, President Donald Trump, I don't think that anything would give him the right to come in between and talk on behest of a third person, of a third party at all. So, but if he manages to get peace, all that he's done would be cleaned off and we would see peace then. But if he's unable to get peace for some reason, then I think he would lose further credibility. As it is, he's been losing credibility, I see, by the statement that he's making and by the U-turn that he's been taking on his statements. And people have stopped taking it very, very seriously now. People take it with a pinch of salt. But now, because when he mentioned that if he comes in power, within 24 hours, he will stop all the wars that are happening around the world. Be it the Israel-Palestinian war, be it the Russian-Ukraine war, anywhere. But we didn't see any sign of it so far. So hopefully, yes, because we saw a viral video where the last time when President Putin and President Donald Trump were meeting and the firm handshake and the body language said that, okay, yes, we could see some good bright days in future, that we could see peace coming in. But there are certain things like, the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, he didn't mention that he had a telephonic conversation with them. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who had not attended the summit, he said the Ukraine is counting on support. Now, some Ukrainian military officers were openly doubtful about this, and they were saying that they expect no peace. That's what Ukraine had said over there. Now, there were commanders who described the war as ongoing with heavy losses and no sign of Putin in willing to compromise. The Kremlin had said that Putin will arrive on time, despite the history of tardiness and world leaders. Now he's on his way. He stepped in, Magadan, to visit a plant, meet officials, the great school children, and greet the school children over there before the 4-hour flight to Anchorage. Anchorage is where they had met in Alaska at 3:30 p.m. ET and 11:30 a.m. the local time, as per the US timing. Now, which was closely monitored and watched by people around. And the choice of venue which was provided, challenging during Alaska's busy tourist season, was leaving a few suitable sites for hosting. Both leaders ultimately joined base Admiral Ford Richardson on the outskirts of Anchorage was selected. Now, despite the optics of holding a meeting on the US military base, here what they would have discussed, that's what's important. Now, Lukashenko, the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, his conversation with Trump is seen as significant because often it's referred to as Europe's last dictator. Yes.
Major, sorry, we are running out of time for this discussion, but thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insight. That was Major Dr. Muhammad Ali Shah. Now we move on. Russian President Vladimir Putin has spoken for over 8 minutes at a joint press conference with U.S. President Donald Trump after the Alaska summit. He thanked President Trump for peace efforts on the Ukraine war. No ceasefire deal was reached, but President Putin has said that the talks could pave a path to peace if Russia's concerns are addressed. Let's listen in to what President Putin had said in the press conference.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We have very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. In good health and to see you alive." I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of, more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. It was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are two flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots that buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they've fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue. Naturally, under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And Special Envoy of the President, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the US. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the US, there was a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that, in political sphere. I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good, business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
This is all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.